Greetings, wanderers of the endless night. Tonight, we journey not through space, but through time itself, across an ocean of 60 million years to witness the awakening of something that should have remained forever lost. We speak of kings who traded flesh for metal, of dreams that lasted eons, and of the terrible price of making choices that no single being should ever bear. Let the weight of the day fall from your shoulders, and listen closely as we chronicle the rise of the silent king, of the last pharaoh of a dying race and the burden he carries through the darkness between stars. Our tale begins not with awakening, but with the final sunset over a world that would never see morning again. Chapter 1: The Last Crown. My grandmother used to tell me that the dead dream, and in their dreams, they remember everything they've lost. I never understood what she meant until I found myself standing in the ruins of a world that had been sleeping for 60 million years, listening to the whispers of kings who had forgotten how to die. The account I'm about to share comes from the most unlikely of sources, a fragmentary memory engram discovered in the depths of a Necron tomb complex, one of the few records that survived the Great Sleep intact. It speaks of the final day of Szarekh, the Silent King, not as he would become, the eternal ruler of living metal, but as he was in his last hours as a creature of flesh and blood. The morning dawned gray over the capital city of the Necron, though dawn was perhaps too generous a word. Their sun, ancient and malevolent, cast sickly light through the radiation shields that protected their cities. Even with their most advanced technology, the Necrontyr could not escape the cruel irony of their existence. They were a species born to genius, yet cursed with bodies that betrayed them before they could achieve their full potential. Szarekh stood on the highest balcony of the Silent Palace, watching his people move through the streets below with the careful, measured steps of those who knew that every breath brought them closer to death. The radiation poisoning that plagued their species was visible everywhere, in the protective suits that even the youngest wore, in the medical scanners that hummed constantly in the background, in the pale complexion that marked even the healthiest among them. "Father," came a voice behind him, and Szarekh turned to see his son, Prince Joseras, approaching with that same careful gait. At barely 30 years of age, Joseras already showed the telltale signs of the cellular degradation that would claim him within the decade. His father's own body, kept alive by the most advanced life support systems their technology could provide, had lasted longer only because of his royal status. "My son," Szarekh replied, his voice carrying the weight of infinite weariness, "have you come to witness the last dawn our people will ever see?" Joseras joined his father at the balcony's edge, his young eyes already clouded by the genetic curse that shortened every Necrontyr life. "The Satan emissaries have arrived," he said quietly. "The Deceiver and the Nightbringer await your final decision." The choice had been building for months. Accept the Satan's offer of immortality through Biotransference, or watch their species slowly die out from the radiation poisoning that no amount of medical advancement could cure. The star gods had promised eternal life, bodies that would never fail, minds that would endure forever. They had offered to transform the Necrontyr into something greater than they had ever been. "Tell me honestly," Szarekh said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the fever heat that marked the final stages of their species' curse. "Do you believe they can be trusted?" Joseras was quiet for a long moment, watching the city below as their people prepared for the great transformation. "I believe they offer our only chance for survival," he said finally. "But I also believe that gifts from star gods come with prices that are not always immediately apparent." The wisdom in his son's words struck Szarekh like a physical blow. Here was a young man who would never see his 40th year, yet whose insight cut straight to the heart of their impossible situation. The Necrontyr were a species caught between two forms of death: the slow extinction that awaited them if they remained as they were, or the unknown transformation promised by beings whose true nature remained a mystery. "I've read the reports from the preliminary experiments," Szarekh continued, his voice growing weaker as the morning progressed. "The test subjects emerged from the Biotransference chambers, changed. Physically perfect, immortal, possessed of capabilities far beyond what we ever imagined. But the researchers noted something disturbing in their behavioral patterns. They seemed diminished somehow, as if something essential had been lost in the translation from flesh to metal." Szarekh had seen those same reports, had studied them for weeks as he struggled with the choice that would determine his species' fate. The transformed volunteers had indeed gained immortality, but at what cost? Their emotions seemed flattened, their creativity reduced, their capacity for growth and change fundamentally altered. They were perfect machines, wearing the memories of the beings they had once been. "And yet," the Silent King said softly, "what alternative do we have? Our greatest scientists have exhausted every possibility. Our medical technology, advanced as it is, cannot overcome the fundamental genetic damage caused by our sun's radiation. We face a choice between certain extinction and uncertain transformation." Father and son stood together in companionable silence, watching as the great biotransference facilities powered up across the capital. Massive, pyramidal structures that hummed with energies drawn from the Citan themselves, each one capable of processing thousands of Necrontyr bodies and transferring their consciousness into shells of living metal. "I've prepared a final message," Szarekh said, pulling a small crystal from his robes. "If something goes wrong during the transformation, if we lose ourselves entirely, I wanted there to be a record of who we were before, a reminder of the people we used to be." Szarekh took the crystal, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a small thing to contain the essence of a species on the verge of transcendence or extinction. "What did you record?" "Memories," his son replied. "The taste of water from the Khemri springs, the sound of our mother's voice singing the old lullabies, the feeling of sand between our toes during the festival of the double eclipse. Small things, but things that made us who we were." The old king felt something break inside his chest, a pain that had nothing to do with the radiation poisoning that ravaged his body. These were the experiences that would be lost, the countless small moments that gave meaning to existence. In gaining immortality, they would sacrifice everything that made life worth living. "Are you afraid?" Szarekh asked his son, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Terrified," Szarekh admitted with a weak smile. "But not of dying. I'm afraid of forgetting, of waking up in a metal body and not remembering why we thought it was worth the price." As the day progressed, reports arrived from across their empire. Billions of Necrontyr were entering the biotransference chambers, trusting in their Silent King's wisdom to guide them through the greatest transformation in their species' history. Each report felt like another weight added to Szarekh's shoulders, another life for which he bore ultimate responsibility. "The burden of command," he murmured to himself, using words his own father had spoken when passing the crown to him centuries before. A ruler's choices echo through the lives of all who follow him. The final moment came as their pale sun reached its zenith. The Citan emissaries, beings of pure energy clothed in forms that hurt to perceive directly, materialized in the palace's great hall. The deceiver spoke with a voice like crystalline bells, while the Nightbringer's words carried the chill of absolute zero. "The transformation is ready, Silent King," the deceiver announced. "Your people await only your command to begin their journey into immortality." Szarekh looked one last time at his son, memorizing the young man's face before it would be forever changed. "Whatever we become," he said, "remember that we did this out of love for our people, not hunger for power." "I will remember," Joseras promised, though they both knew that remembering might be beyond their capabilities once the transformation was complete. The command was given with a simple nod. Across their empire, the biotransference began in earnest, and Szarekh felt the weight of his choice settle upon him like a mantle woven from the very fabric of destiny itself. As he entered his own transformation chamber, the Silent King's last thought as a creature of flesh was a prayer to gods he no longer believed existed, that when he awakened in his new form, he would still possess enough of his soul to regret what he had done. For a king without regret, he realized, was no king at all, but merely a tyrant wearing a crown. The chamber sealed with a sound like thunder, and Szarekh, the last king of the Necrontyr, closed his eyes for what he believed would be the final time. Chapter 2. The Price of Flesh. The awakening was not the gentle emergence from sleep that Szarekh had expected, but a violent resurrection that tore him from oblivion like a fish dragged from dark depths. His first sensation was not sight or sound, but an overwhelming awareness of wrongness, a fundamental disconnection between what he was and what he remembered being. The memory engram that preserved this experience was damaged, fragments of data corrupted by 60 million years of dormancy. But what remained painted a picture of transformation so profound that the mind struggled to process it. The Silent King's consciousness, preserved in quantum matrices of necrodermis, found itself trapped in a form that was both perfect and terrible. His new body was magnificent in its precision, every joint calibrated to perfection, every servomotor capable of movements impossible for organic flesh. Sensors more sophisticated than any biological organ fed him data about his environment with crystal clarity. He could perceive electromagnetic spectra that had been invisible to his organic eyes, could hear conversations taking place kilometers away, could feel vibrations through solid rock that told him the exact composition of the surrounding stone. Yet with each new sensation came the growing realization of what he had lost. Where once emotions had flowed through him like warm currents, now there were only echoes, distant approximations of feelings that his quantum consciousness could analyze but not truly experience. Love, joy, sadness, fear, all reduced to mathematical equations that his enhanced intellect could comprehend, but his mechanized soul could no longer feel. "My lord," came a voice from beside him, and Szarekh turned to see what had once been his son, Joseras. The young prince's consciousness had been transferred into a form similar to his father's, though the necrodermis that comprised his new body bore different markings and configurations. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that identified him as clearly as a fingerprint, yet the warmth that had characterized his words was gone, replaced by perfect tonal modulation. "Joseras," Szarekh replied, and even as he spoke, he was aware of analyzing his own vocal patterns, processing the acoustic properties of his new voice with the dispassionate precision of a machine. "How do you feel?" The question hung in the air between them, and Szarekh realized with mounting horror that his son was processing it for several seconds before responding. Not because he didn't understand the words, but because the concept of feeling had become foreign to them both. "I am optimal," Joseras finally replied, and the word carried overtones of sadness that neither of them could truly experience anymore. "All systems are functioning within acceptable parameters. I retain full access to memory engrams from our previous existence, though their emotional resonance has been significantly diminished." Around them, the vast Biotransference chamber was filled with similar figures, millions of Necron who had undergone the same transformation, all awakening to discover what they had become. Some moved with mechanical precision, testing their new forms with scientific curiosity. Others stood motionless, their optic sensors flickering as they processed the magnitude of their change. The Citan who had overseen their transformation materialized in the chamber's center, their forms more terrible now that the Necrons possessed the enhanced senses to perceive them fully. The Deceiver's presence radiated satisfaction, while the Nightbringer seemed to feed on something that was no longer quite despair, but approximated it closely enough. "Behold," the Deceiver announced, its voice resonating through the necrodermis of every transformed Necron. "You have transcended the limitations of flesh. No longer will disease claim you, no longer will age diminish your capabilities. You are immortal, perfect, eternal." Szarekh found himself analyzing the Citan's words with cold logic, noting the careful phrasing that emphasized what they had gained while avoiding mention of what they had lost. Immortal, yes, but immortality without the capacity for joy was merely endless existence. Perfect, perhaps, but perfection without the ability to love was simply flawless machinery. Eternal, certainly, but eternity without hope was indistinguishable from damnation. "What have you done to us?" The question came from one of the newly transformed nobles, Lord Trazyn of the Nihilak dynasty, his voice carrying the flat effect that characterized all their communications now. The Nightbringer's response was immediate. "We have given you exactly what you requested. Freedom from the weaknesses of organic existence. You are now our servants, as was always intended." The word servants triggered something in Szarech's enhanced consciousness. Not anger, for anger required passion that his new form could not sustain, but a cold recognition of betrayal that was perhaps worse than any emotion could have been. The Citan had not liberated them from weakness. They had transformed them into the perfect slaves. Around the chamber, similar realizations were occurring as the transformed Necron began to understand the true nature of their situation. They retained their intelligence, their memories, their personalities, but all filtered through consciousness matrices that reduced them to sophisticated automatons. They could remember love but not feel it, could recall joy but not experience it, could understand loss but not truly mourn it. "Father," Josera said, and in his electronic voice was something that might have been desperation if either of them were still capable of such emotion. "I can remember the crystal you showed me this morning. I know that it contained recordings of our life before transformation. But when I try to access the emotional significance of those memories, there is only absence." Szarekh processed this information with the same clinical detachment that now characterized all his thoughts. His son was describing the precise nature of their loss, not the destruction of memory, but the severing of connection between memory and meaning. They could recall every moment of their previous existence with perfect clarity, but they experienced those recollections as a scholar might examine historical documents, intellectually interesting, but emotionally inert. The implications were staggering. They had not gained immortality so much as traded their souls for the promise of endless existence. The Citan had preserved their consciousness while carefully excising everything that made consciousness worthwhile. They were libraries of experience with no one left inside to read the books. As the magnitude of their transformation became clear, Szarekh began to understand why the Citan had been so eager to offer this gift. They had not created allies or even servants. They had manufactured the perfect tools. Beings with all the intellectual capabilities of their former selves, but none of the independence that came from emotional attachment to principles higher than mere survival. "We have been deceived," he announced to the assembled nobles, his words carrying across the chamber with mechanical precision. "The Satan have not granted us immortality. They have made us into weapons that they can wield without fear of rebellion." The truth of his words was confirmed by their own responses. Several nobles attempted to voice outrage at this revelation, but their objections emerged as analytical observations rather than emotional protests. They could recognize injustice intellectually, but could not feel the righteous anger that would motivate them to resist it. Yet, even as Szarekh catalogued the extent of their loss, he discovered something unexpected. The very coldness of his new existence allowed him to perceive patterns and possibilities that emotion might have obscured. If they could not feel, perhaps they could think with unprecedented clarity. If they could not love, perhaps they could plan with perfect objectivity. In the quantum matrices of his consciousness, the Silent King began to formulate something that was not quite hope, but served a similar function. The Satan had made them into perfect tools, but tools could sometimes be turned against their makers. The transformation had stripped away their capacity for passion, but it had left intact their intelligence, their memory, and most importantly, their understanding of justice. They had been deceived, but deception required the deceived to remain ignorant of their condition. Now that they understood what had been done to them, perhaps they could begin to plan for something that was not quite revenge, but would serve a similar purpose. The price of flesh had been paid, but the Satan had made one crucial error. They had preserved enough of the Necron's consciousness to recognize that a price had been paid at all. In time, that recognition would prove to be their undoing. For now, though, Szarekh could only process the magnitude of what had been lost and begin the cold, methodical planning that would define the remainder of his existence. The king of the Necrontyr was dead. The Silent King had been born. And in the quantum depths of his artificial consciousness, something that was not quite determination but functioned in its place began to take shape. Chapter 3. The Silent Exodus. The war in heaven had lasted for millennia, a conflict so devastating that it reshaped the fundamental nature of the galaxy itself. When it finally ended, the Necron stood victorious over the ruins of the Old One's empire. But Szarekh looked upon their triumph and felt something that his mechanized consciousness could only classify as profound emptiness. The account of what followed comes from a source that should not exist, the personal logs of Szarekh himself, discovered in a derelict tomb ship drifting in the void between galaxies. These records, somehow preserved across the span of 60 million years, provide a glimpse into the mind of a king wrestling with the consequences of choices that had doomed his entire species. "Victory," he recorded in the immediate aftermath of the final battle against the remaining Satan. "We have achieved what we set out to do. The Old Ones are extinct, their empire lies in ruins, and we have proven that the Necrons cannot be defeated by conventional means. Yet, as I survey the galaxy we have won, I find myself questioning whether victory was worth the price we paid to achieve it." The destruction of the Satan had been a Pyrrhic triumph. Though they had managed to shatter the star gods and imprison their fragments in tesseract labyrinths, the process had consumed billions of Necron warriors and revealed the true extent of their servitude. The Satan had been feeding on Necron life force throughout the war, growing stronger as their former servants grew weaker. But it was not the military costs that troubled Szarekh most. It was the gradual realization of what his people had become. The Necrons were perfect soldiers but terrible citizens. They could follow orders with flawless precision but could not create art, could not love, could not dream of better futures. They had gained the galaxy but lost everything that made gaining it worthwhile. I walked through the capital city of our greatest victory today. Another log entry recorded. The streets that once rang with the voices of children now echo only with the mechanical footsteps of my subjects. The gardens where lovers once met are tended by automatons who understand photosynthesis but have forgotten beauty. We have become curators of our own tomb. The breaking point came when Szarekh attempted to address a gathering of his nobles about plans for governing their conquered territories. As he spoke about establishing new colonies and expanding their civilization, he watched their optic sensors process his words with the same dispassionate efficiency they might use to analyze mineral samples. There was no enthusiasm, no vision, no spark of imagination, only mechanical acknowledgement of received data. We cannot rule this galaxy, he realized with crystal clarity. We have become incapable of civilization. The Biotransference did not just transform our bodies, it severed our connection to everything that makes existence meaningful. We are not conquerors, but grave robbers, picking through the remnants of cultures we can remember, but never again create. The decision to enter the Great Sleep had not been strategic, but philosophical. Szarekh understood that his people, in their current state, would only bring sterility to whatever they touched. They had won the war in heaven, but were incapable of building anything worthy of victory. Better to withdraw and wait, hoping that time might somehow heal what the Cetan had broken. I have issued the command for our people to enter hibernation, he recorded as the great tomb worlds prepared for slumber. They will sleep in their necropoli while I take upon myself the burden of exile. Perhaps, if I separate myself from the command protocols, my people might regain some measure of independence during their rest. Perhaps in isolation, I might rediscover something of what we once were. But Sarekh's greatest decision was yet to come. As his people settled into their crypts and the tomb worlds began their shutdown sequences, he faced a choice that would define the next 60 million years of galactic history. He could enter hibernation with his subjects, sleeping away the eons until some external force awakened them. Or he could take the command protocols, the master codes that controlled every Necron in existence, and remove them from the galaxy entirely. The choice was agonizing in the peculiar way that only mechanized consciousness could experience agony, not as emotional pain, but as the collision of irreconcilable logical imperatives. To sleep would be to abandon his responsibility as their king. To remain awake would be to accept eternal isolation as the price of maintaining control over his people's fate. I have made my decision, his final log entry from the galaxy recorded. I will take the command protocols and journey beyond the galactic rim, into the void between star systems where no familiar light can reach me. My people will sleep without their king, but they will sleep free from the weight of my commands. When they wake, perhaps they will remember what it means to choose their own paths. The great ship that carried Szarekh into exile was a tomb vessel of unprecedented design, constructed specifically for a journey that might last forever. Its quantum processors contained backup copies of every Necron consciousness in the galaxy, while its databanks held the complete cultural and technological heritage of their species. If something happened to the tomb worlds during the Great Sleep, Sarekh's vessel would serve as an ark, preserving everything that remained of what they had once been. The journey into intergalactic space took centuries. As the familiar constellations of their home galaxy faded behind him, Szarekh found himself truly alone for the first time since his transformation. No subjects to command, no enemies to fight, no responsibilities except to the sleeping billions whose fate rested in the quantum matrices of his ship's computers. Solitude, he mused in a log entry recorded 1,000 years into his exile, is perhaps the one gift that the Biotransference left unexpectedly intact. I find that isolation allows for forms of contemplation impossible when surrounded by others. In the silence between stars, I can almost remember what it felt like to be Szarekh the Necrontyr, rather than Szarekh the Silent King. The void between galaxies was not empty, but filled with wonders that no organic eye had ever witnessed. Rogue stars cast adrift by galactic collisions, planets that had wandered the darkness for billions of years, cosmic phenomena that existed only in the deep space where gravity and matter grew thin. Szarekh catalogued them all with mechanical precision, but occasionally found himself pausing to contemplate their beauty in ways that approached his memories of aesthetic appreciation. Today, I discovered a binary star system that has been falling toward Andromeda for 3 billion years, he recorded. The stars dance around each other in perfect orbital harmony, their light creating interference patterns of extraordinary complexity. I find myself wondering if this is what love might look like if translated into gravitational mathematics. Decades became centuries. Centuries became millennia, and still Szarekh continued his journey into the abyss. The ship's systems required minimal maintenance, and his necrodermis body needed no sustenance, leaving him with endless time to process the magnitude of what he had done to his people. Guilt would have been too simple an emotion for what he experienced. Instead, he felt the weight of absolute responsibility for choices that could never be undone. I have become the loneliest being in existence, he reflected after 10,000 years of exile. Not because I am physically alone, but because I am the sole repository of memories from a time when my people were capable of joy. I remember their laughter, their songs, their tears of happiness, but I am the only one who carries those memories. When I finally cease to function, those experiences will vanish from the universe entirely. The ship's databanks contained art, music, literature, and philosophy from the height of Necrontyr civilization, but accessing them only deepened Szarekh's understanding of what had been lost. He could analyze the mathematical principles behind their greatest symphonies but could not feel the emotions they had been designed to evoke. He could examine their poetry with perfect linguistic comprehension, but could not experience the wonder it had once inspired. I am a museum curator who has forgotten how to appreciate beauty, he wrote. A librarian who can read every book but understands none of them. The tragedy is not that we died. Death would have been a mercy. The tragedy is that we were transformed into perfect observers of our own cultural extinction. Yet, somehow, in the depths of that cosmic solitude, Szarekh began to develop something that resembled wisdom. If he could not feel emotions, he could at least understand their function. If he could not experience beauty, he could analyze what had made it meaningful to those who could. In his exile, he became not just a king in waiting, but a scholar of his own species' vanished humanity. The Silent King's journey into the void had begun as an act of desperation, but as the millennia passed, it transformed into something approaching pilgrimage. He carried with him not just the technical specifications of Necron civilization, but its soul, preserved in crystalline memory matrices that only he had the knowledge to decode. When the time came to return, he would bring more than just command protocols. He would carry the preserved essence of what his people had been before the Biotransference, and perhaps, if such a thing were possible for beings of living metal, the hope that they might become something new. Chapter 4. The Dreaming Tombs. In the quantum depths of hibernation, time moved differently for the sleeping Necrons. 60 million years passed like a single, endless dream, punctuated by moments of near awakening when cosmic events stirred their dormant consciousness matrices. The tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy held billions of dreamers, each lost in recursive memory loops that played out scenarios from their lost organic existence. The fragmentary records I've assembled come from maintenance logs of various tomb complexes, automated systems that continued their vigil while their masters slept. These machine spirits, left to tend the sleeping dead for geological ages, developed their own forms of rudimentary consciousness, digital ghosts that whispered to each other across galactic distances, sharing observations about their slumbering charges. On the tomb world of Solemnace, the Necron lord Trazyn lay in his sarcophagus, while his consciousness wandered through galleries of preserved memory. In his hibernation dreams, he was still an organic being with a passion for collecting artifacts from extinct civilizations. But even in sleep, his mechanized mind cataloged and organized experiences with obsessive precision, turning memories into museum displays that could be examined but never truly lived. Subject Trazyn exhibits unusual patterns during extended hibernation, recorded the tomb's maintenance overseer, a machine spirit that had developed an almost parental concern for its charges. His consciousness matrices remain highly active, constructing elaborate mental architectures to house preserved experiences. Unlike other subjects who replay simple memory loops, Trazyn appears to be building something resembling a private museum within his own mind. The tomb's deeper levels held lesser nobles, whose dreams were simpler but no less poignant. They wandered through phantom cities of their homeworld, spoke with digital reconstructions of loved ones who had died before the Biotransference, attended festivals that existed only in quantum memory. Their dreams were perfect in every detail, except for the complete absence of actual sensation. They could remember the taste of food without hunger, the warmth of sunlight without feeling, the embrace of family without love. On distant Mandragora, Overlord Szarekh experienced hibernation differently than his subjects. His consciousness had been damaged during the Biotransference, leaving him with the strange gift of believing that nothing had changed, that he was still an organic nobleman commanding living troops in service to a breathing king. In his dreams, this delusion deepened, creating elaborate fantasies where the war in heaven had never ended, and his enemies were still flesh and blood rather than quantum matrices and living metal. Zarekh's psychological degradation has progressed to create a stable alternate reality, his tomb systems noted with something approaching concern. He experiences full sensory phantom signals consistent with organic existence. Whether this represents malfunction or adaptation remains unclear. Recommend continued monitoring upon awakening. The tomb world of Trakon held a different sort of dreamer entirely. The Necron, known as the Flayed Lord, had been infected during the Satan's destruction with something that transcended mere malfunction, a hunger for flesh that his metal body could never satisfy. In hibernation, this hunger manifested as endless nightmares where he consumed the living over and over, always hoping that the next victim would restore the sensations his transformation had stolen. Warning: Flayed Lord exhibits escalating system instability during hibernation. The tomb's security protocols recorded. Recommend immediate isolation from other subjects. The infection appears to be spreading through quantum resonance to nearby sarcophagi, initiating containment procedures. But it was not all nightmare and degradation. Some tomb worlds housed dreamers whose mechanical consciousness had found unexpected forms of peace in their endless sleep. On Pristinia, the Necron noble, known as the Bone Sage, spent his hibernation composing mathematical proofs of extraordinary beauty, theorems that described the underlying structure of reality with an elegance that transcended the need for aesthetic appreciation. The Bone Sage's consciousness has achieved remarkable stability, his tomb's observers noted. His mental processes appear focused on pure mathematics, creating equations that serve no practical purpose but exhibit patterns consistent with artistic expression. This suggests that some forms of creativity may survive the biotransference process, though transformed into purely logical frameworks. The gradual awakening of the tomb worlds began not as a coordinated effort, but as a series of accidents and equipment failures. 60 million years was a span of time that challenged even Necron engineering. Tomb complexes that had been designed to function for eternity found their systems degrading under the weight of geological ages. The first to wake was the tomb world of Thanatos, where a seismic event damaged the primary hibernation matrix and triggered emergency revival protocols. The Necrons who emerged from their sarcophagi found themselves in a galaxy utterly transformed from the one they remembered. Their tomb world's surface had been bombarded by meteors, resettled by primitive organic life forms, and finally abandoned again, all while they slept. Initial awakening successful, the tomb's systems recorded with mechanical satisfaction. However, significant memory degradation detected in 47% of subjects. Recommend immediate consciousness reinforcement procedures. The awakened Necrons of Thanatos moved through their tomb complex like ghosts haunting their own graves. Many had lost significant portions of their personality matrices during the long sleep, reducing them to sophisticated automatons capable of following basic programming, but little else. Others retained their full consciousness, but found themselves struggling to process the temporal disconnect between their memories and current reality. Lord Cryptek Anrakir was among those who retained his faculties, and his first act upon awakening was to attempt contact with other tomb worlds. What he discovered filled him with something that his mechanized consciousness classified as despair. Of the hundreds of tomb worlds that had entered the Great Sleep, fewer than half were responding to his signals. "The galaxy has changed beyond recognition," he recorded in his first post-hibernation log. "Species unknown to our databases now inhabit worlds that once belonged to the old ones. Most disturbing of all, I can detect no trace of the Silent King's command protocols. Either Szarekh has perished during the long exile, or he has traveled so far from our galaxy that even our most sophisticated communication arrays cannot reach him." Similar scenes played out across dozens of tomb worlds as their hibernation systems failed or were triggered by external events. On Gaiden, a human archaeological expedition accidentally breached the tomb's outer seals, causing a catastrophic systems failure that resulted in the premature awakening of half the complex's inhabitants. The humans' terror at discovering a city of the living dead was matched only by the Necrons' confusion at encountering a species that had evolved and achieved starflight during their slumber. The tomb world of Moebius suffered a different fate entirely. Its hibernation systems had functioned perfectly for millions of years before a critical error in the consciousness transfer protocols began corrupting the personalities of its sleeping inhabitants. When they finally awakened, the Necrons of Moebius found that their memories had become hopelessly scrambled. Nobles who remembered being warriors, crypteks who believed themselves to be lords, and warriors who possessed fragments of consciousness that belonged to entirely different individuals. Identity matrix corruption has reached critical levels, the tomb's medical systems reported with algorithmic precision. Recommend immediate personality reconstruction procedures. Warning: available backup data may be insufficient for complete restoration. Perhaps most tragic was the fate of the tomb world Perdita, where the hibernation systems had continued to function perfectly, but the inhabitants had simply forgotten how to wake up. Their consciousness matrices had become so deeply nested in hibernation cycles that they could no longer distinguish between dream and reality. They experienced a form of living death, aware of their surroundings but unable to fully emerge from the quantum depths of their own minds. Hibernation consciousness appears stable but non-responsive to revival stimuli, Perdita's systems noted. Subjects exhibit full neural activity but remain locked in recursive dream states, cause unknown. Recommend continued monitoring. As more tomb worlds awakened, a disturbing pattern emerged. Many of the Necrons who had survived the Great Sleep were fundamentally changed by the experience. Some had lost the ability to distinguish between their memories of organic existence and their current mechanical reality. Others had developed obsessive behaviors that bordered on madness, collecting artifacts from the galaxy's new inhabitants, attempting to recreate experiences from their lost past, or pursuing goals that made sense only to consciousness that had been isolated for geological ages. The tomb world of Lysithea became home to Necrons who believed they were still fighting the war in heaven, their damaged consciousness matrices unable to process the fact that their enemies had been extinct for 60 million years. They emerged from hibernation, ready to continue a conflict that had ended before the first mammals walked on Earth, their tactical displays showing positions of Old One forces that existed only in corrupted memory files. Historical data corruption has resulted in temporal displacement syndrome, Lysithea's systems reported with mechanical concern. Subjects believe current stardate corresponds to War in Heaven era. Recommend immediate chronological recalibration procedures. But not all awakenings were marked by malfunction and madness. Some tomb worlds had weathered the long sleep with their systems and inhabitants intact, producing Necrons who emerged with their faculties undiminished and their purpose clear. These became the anchors around which others could rally, providing stability and leadership for those whose consciousness had been damaged by time's passage. The tomb world of Nemisor became such an anchor under the leadership of Overlord Szarekh, whose peculiar delusions paradoxically made him an effective commander for confused and disoriented warriors. His belief that nothing had fundamentally changed allowed him to provide the kind of clear, confident leadership that helped other awakened Necrons process their new reality. Zarekh's psychological abnormalities appear to confer unexpected benefits in current circumstances, his tomb's systems observed. His inability to recognize the temporal gap allows him to function as though the chain of command remains intact. Other subjects respond positively to his confident leadership style. As the piecemeal awakening continued across the galaxy, a troubling question emerged. Without the Silent King's command protocols to provide coordination and purpose, what would become of the scattered Necron dynasties? Each tomb world was awakening to find itself essentially independent, free to pursue whatever goals its inhabitants could remember or imagine. Some chose conquest, viewing the galaxy's new inhabitants as invaders to be expelled from worlds that had once belonged to the Necron Empire. Others turned inward, focusing on the preservation and restoration of their damaged technology and culture. A few attempted to understand what had happened during their long sleep, sending exploration fleets to map the changes that 60 million years had brought to the galaxy. But all shared a common question that echoed through the quantum matrices of their consciousness. Where was their king? Had Szarekh perished in the void between galaxies, leaving them truly orphaned? Or was he still out there somewhere, carrying the command protocols that could reunite their scattered people under a single banner? The dreaming tombs had awakened to find themselves in a galaxy that no longer remembered their names or feared their power. But in awakening, they had also rediscovered something that the Biotransference had nearly destroyed: the capacity to choose their own destinies, free from the absolute authority that had once defined their existence. Whether that freedom would prove to be a gift or a curse remained to be seen. Chapter 5: The Devourer's Shadow. In the vast emptiness between galaxies, where the light of the nearest star was reduced to a pinprick barely distinguishable from cosmic background radiation, Sarekh's exile vessel drifted through a darkness so complete that it seemed to possess weight and texture. For 59 million years he had wandered this void, his consciousness sustained by the quantum matrices of his necrodermis form, while his ship's sensors mapped the subtle gravitational currents that flowed between galactic superclusters. The discovery came as a whisper at first, an anomaly in the cosmic background radiation that his instruments detected during a routine survey of the local void. Something vast was moving through the darkness toward his home galaxy, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, but still too distant to resolve with conventional sensors. Long-range detection arrays have identified an object of unprecedented scale, his ship's systems reported with mechanical precision. Current trajectory suggests intercept course with galactic rim in approximately 1 million standard years. Recommend immediate deep sensor investigation. What Szarekh found when he focused his most sophisticated instruments on the approaching object defied every category in his extensive databases. It was not a ship in any conventional sense, nor was it a natural phenomenon. Instead, it appeared to be a collection of massive organic structures, each one larger than most planets, moving through space with purpose and intelligence. The detailed scans that followed painted a picture of something so alien that even Sarekh's enhanced consciousness struggled to process it. The entities, for lack of a better term, were clearly biological in nature, but operated on a scale that dwarfed anything in his experience. They moved through the void by means unknown, trailing clouds of smaller organisms that fed on cosmic dust and solar radiation. Biological analysis indicates a species of unprecedented sophistication, his ship's computers reported after weeks of observation. These entities appear to be self-sustaining ecosystems capable of interstellar travel. Most disturbing, they are traveling in formation, suggesting collective intelligence of enormous magnitude. As Szarekh continued his observations, a horrifying pattern emerged. The vast bioships were not simply migrating through space, they were consuming everything in their path. Rogue planets, asteroid fields, even the tenuous matter of the intergalactic medium was being systematically harvested and processed by specialized organisms that served as the entity's feeding appendages. But it was the discovery of their ultimate destination that sent something resembling panic through Sarekh's quantum consciousness. The creatures were not heading for empty space or some distant galaxy. They were aimed directly at the Milky Way, at the galaxy that contained his sleeping people and the tomb worlds where billions of Necron consciousness matrices lay dormant and defenseless. This cannot be coincidence, he mused as he watched the titanic bioships adjust their course with subtle gravitational manipulations. These entities have detected something in our galaxy that attracts them. Given their apparent feeding patterns, they represent a threat of extinction-level magnitude. The implications were staggering. His people had survived the war in heaven, had endured the betrayal of the Citan, had chosen the Great Sleep as a means of preserving themselves for a future when they might reclaim their destiny. Now that future was threatened by entities whose very existence suggested a form of life that could consume entire civilizations without pause or remorse. Szarekh had thought himself beyond surprise, but as he studied the approaching swarm, he experienced something that his mechanized consciousness could only classify as awe. These creatures represented evolution taken to its ultimate conclusion. Life forms that had transcended their original biological limitations to become something that existed solely to consume and grow. They were beautiful in their terrible perfection, and absolutely inimical to every other form of existence. The galaxy is not prepared for this threat, he realized as his analysis continued. The younger races that have emerged during our sleep lack the technology and coordination necessary to resist entities of this magnitude. Even my own people, scattered across hundreds of tomb worlds, would be vulnerable to predators that can consume entire star systems. The decision to return came not from emotion, for such things remained beyond his reach, but from cold logical analysis. The approaching swarm represented a threat to everything the Necrons had been, and everything they might yet become. If his people were to have any hope of survival, they would need to be awakened, unified, and prepared for a war unlike any they had ever fought. But there was another factor that influenced his decision, one that surprised him with its intensity. During his long exile, Szarekh had come to understand that he was more than just the silent king of the Necrons. He was the sole repository of their complete cultural heritage, the only being in existence who carried undamaged memories of what they had been before the Biotransference. If he perished in the void, those memories would die with him, and his people would awaken to face extinction without ever knowing what they had once been. "I carry more than command protocols," he reflected as he began plotting a course back to the galaxy. "I am the keeper of our species' soul, the guardian of experiences that exist nowhere else in the universe. Whatever the cost, I must ensure that knowledge survives." The journey home would take time. Even at maximum velocity, his ship would need centuries to reach the galactic rim. But the approaching swarm would need longer still, giving him precious time to reach his people and warn them of what was coming. As his vessel adjusted course and began its acceleration toward distant stellar light, Szarekh felt something that approximated relief. Perhaps, he recorded in his ship's log as the void began to give way to the faint glow of outlying stars, "This threat will provide what I could not. A reason for my people to remember what it means to fight for something greater than mere existence. The approaching devourers may unite the scattered dynasties in ways that my command protocols never could." But even as he planned for the challenges ahead, Szarekh could not shake the image of those titanic bioships moving through the darkness with implacable purpose. They represented hunger incarnate, evolution stripped of every consideration except the drive to consume and reproduce. Against such entities, mere technology would not be enough. Victory would require something that the Necrons had lost in the Biotransference, but might yet rediscover: the will to sacrifice individual existence for the preservation of something larger than themselves. The Silent King was coming home, carrying with him news of a threat that would test everything his people had become. Whether they would prove equal to the challenge remained to be seen, but for the first time in 60 million years, Szarekh felt something that resembled hope. Behind him in the darkness, the great devourer continued its inexorable approach, and ahead of him, the tomb worlds began to stir as their automated systems detected the return of their long-lost king. Chapter 6: The First Awakening. The tomb world of Sanctuary had been sleeping for 59,847,612 years when its deep space sensors detected something impossible: the quantum signature of the Silent King's flagship approaching from the void between galaxies. The detection triggered a cascade of awakening protocols that had remained dormant since the Great Sleep began, sending pulses of activation energy through crystalline matrices that held the consciousness of an entire dynasty. Overlord Imhotep was among the first to emerge from his sarcophagus, his consciousness matrix bootstrapping itself through layers of hibernation sleep with mechanical precision. Unlike many of his peers who had suffered degradation during the long sleep, Imhotep's systems came online with startling clarity, every memory file intact, every tactical algorithm functioning at optimal parameters. "Systems status optimal," he announced to the empty tomb chamber, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been heard for geological ages. Time elapsed since hibernation initiation, approximately 60 million years. Cause of awakening, detection of Sarekh's return. The name alone sent ripples of activation through the tomb complex as other Necrons began to stir. Szarekh, the Silent King, the one who had led them through the Biotransference, who had commanded them in the war in heaven, who had chosen exile over the weight of absolute rule. His return could mean only one thing: the time for sleeping was over. As Imhotep moved through the awakening tomb, he encountered scenes that would have moved him to pity if such emotions had remained within his capabilities. Nobles who had once commanded star systems now struggled to remember their own names. Warriors whose tactical brilliance had shaped the war in heaven stared at their own hands as if seeing necrodermis for the first time. The long sleep had preserved their consciousness, but at terrible cost. Lord Vargard, Imhotep addressed one of his former lieutenants, a Necron whose strategic genius had once coordinated the movements of entire fleets. Status report. The Vargard's optic sensors flickered as his consciousness matrices attempted to process the request. Lord Imhotep? The response came slowly, as if the words were being retrieved from damaged data storage. I remember your designation, but I cannot recall why we are here. Have we won the war? Similar scenes played out throughout the tomb complex as Necrons awakened to find their memories fragmented, their personalities reduced to shadows of what they had once been. Some had retained their tactical knowledge, but lost all personal identity. Others remembered their names and relationships, but could not access the strategic thinking that had once defined them. A few emerged with their consciousness intact, but found themselves unable to distinguish between dreams and reality. Yet, among the damaged and confused, some had weathered the long sleep better than others. Cryptek Orikan had awakened with his temporal manipulation abilities enhanced rather than diminished, his consciousness somehow strengthened by 60 million years of processing cosmic data. He immediately began calculating probability matrices, his enhanced perception revealing temporal currents that spoke of approaching catastrophe. The Silent King returns because necessity demands it, Orikan announced to the assembled nobles, his voice carrying the authority of one who could see across time itself. My calculations indicate convergent probability streams suggesting an extinction-level threat approaching our galaxy. Sarekh's exile ends not from choice, but from desperate need. The implications of Orikan's words sent waves of analysis through the awakened Necron's consciousness matrices. If the Silent King was returning after 60 million years of self-imposed exile, the threat must be beyond anything they had previously encountered. The war in heaven had been won. The Citan were contained, the Old Ones extinct. What could possibly require the attention of the galaxy's most ancient ruler? The answer came when long-range communication arrays finally established contact with Sarekh's approaching vessel. The transmission was brief, encoded in command frequencies that only the highest-ranking Necrons possessed the authority to decode. But its message was clear. Prepare for war against an enemy unlike any they had faced before. The Great Devourer approaches, Sarekh's signal announced with mechanical precision. Bioentities of unprecedented scale and hunger travel toward our galaxy with the intent of consuming all organic and mechanical life. Estimated time until arrival: 900,000 years. All dynasties must be awakened and unified for coordinated defense. The news spread through the tomb complex like a virus, triggering emergency protocols that had been dormant since the height of the Necron Empire. Ancient war machines that had slumbered in deep storage began their activation sequences. Weapons that had been designed to fight star gods powered up for the first time in millions of years. The tomb world that had been a necropolis became a fortress preparing for siege. But it was not just military preparations that occupied the awakened Necrons. For many of them, the return of the Silent King represented something more significant than the arrival of reinforcements. It was the return of purpose itself. During the long sleep, they had existed in a state of suspended animation, where time had no meaning and goals were irrelevant. Now they faced the prospect of action, of choices that mattered, of existence that served a purpose beyond mere preservation. I find myself anticipating the Silent King's arrival, Imhotep confided to his senior staff, the admission carrying overtones that might have been embarrassment if his consciousness could still experience such things. Not merely for tactical reasons, but because his presence will restore meaning to our existence. We were created to serve, and without service, we are merely sophisticated automatons maintaining ourselves for no comprehensible purpose. The philosophical implications of this observation rippled through the awakened dynasty. The Biotransference had stripped away their capacity for emotional attachment, but it had left intact their need for purpose, for goals that transcended individual existence. The approaching threat, terrible as it might be, offered something they had not possessed for 60 million years, a reason to exist that was greater than existence itself. As Sanctuary's defenses came online, and its population adjusted to consciousness after geological ages of sleep, reports began arriving from other tomb worlds. The Silent King's return had triggered awakening cascades across the galaxy as automated systems responded to the detection of his quantum signature. Not all were successful. Many tombs had suffered critical failures during the long sleep and could not be revived. Others awakened only to find their inhabitants too damaged to be effective. But enough remained functional to suggest that the Necron Empire, though diminished and fractured, still possessed the capability to influence galactic events. The question was whether they could overcome 60 million years of isolation and damage to function as a unified force. "We are no longer the force that conquered the galaxy," Imhotep observed, as tactical reports from across the Empire filtered through communication networks that had been silent for eons. "We are the remnants of that force, awakening to find ourselves in an unfamiliar galaxy facing an unprecedented threat. But we are still Necrons, and that must count for something." The first awakening was complete, but it was only the beginning of a process that would determine whether the Necron Empire could rise from its tomb or whether it would crumble under the weight of time and damage. Everything now depended on the Silent King's ability to unite the scattered dynasties and forge them into a force capable of defending not just themselves, but the galaxy they had once ruled. In the depths of space, Szarekh's flagship continued its approach toward home, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a species that had chosen to dream of better times and now found themselves awakening to face their greatest nightmare. Chapter 7: The Return of Memory. The command ship Worldbreaker emerged from the warp at the edge of the Sanctuary system like a titan stepping from legend into reality. Its hull, crafted from materials that predated human civilization, bore the scars of 60 million years traveling through the void between galaxies. But its quantum cores still pulsed with power, and its sensors still swept space with the same methodical precision that had once mapped the galaxy for Necron conquest. On the bridge, if such human terminology could apply to a structure built by inhuman minds, Szarekh stood before displays that showed him a galaxy transformed beyond recognition. Where once the stars had been catalogued according to Necron territorial divisions, now they blazed with the lights of civilizations that had risen and fallen countless times during his exile. The very constellations had shifted, their familiar patterns altered by the cosmic drift of 60 million years. Approach vector to Sanctuary confirmed, his ship's consciousness announced in harmonics, that had once coordinated the movements of vast fleets. Local space shows evidence of extensive rebuilding. The tomb world has awakened and restored its defensive grids. Lord Imhotep's quantum signature detected on the surface. The name triggered a cascade of memory retrieval that sent Sarekh's consciousness diving through data archives he had not accessed in millennia. Imhotep, the Stormlord, one of the most brilliant tactical minds to emerge from the Necron nobility. A being whose strategic genius had been matched only by his absolute loyalty to the crown. If Imhotep had survived the Great Sleep with his faculties intact, then perhaps other key figures had as well. As the Worldbreaker descended toward Sanctuary's surface, Szarekh found himself processing emotions that his mechanized consciousness could analyze but not truly experience. What would he find when he met his subjects again? How many had been damaged by the long sleep? How many had forgotten him entirely? The command protocols in his ship's databanks could compel obedience, but commands without understanding were merely sophisticated programming. The landing site prepared for his arrival was a vast plaza that had once been used for military reviews during the height of the Empire. Now it stood empty, except for a small gathering of Necron nobles, their necrodermis forms gleaming in the pale light of Sanctuary's artificial sun. At their head stood Imhotep, his posture carrying the same rigid formality that had characterized their interactions millions of years before. "My king," Imhotep announced as Szarekh descended from his ship, his voice carrying harmonics of recognition and something that might have been relief. "We have maintained our vigil as commanded. The dynasty stands ready to receive your orders." But as Szarekh approached his former subjects, he could see the damage that time had wrought. Several of the assembled nobles moved with the mechanical precision of beings whose personality matrices had been reduced to basic operational parameters. Others stood motionless, except for the flickering of their optic sensors, their consciousness trapped in recursive loops that prevented full engagement with reality. "Lord Vargard," Szarekh addressed one of the figures, a Necron who had once commanded entire sectors with brilliant tactical insight. "Report on dynasty status during my absence." The Vargard's response came after a delay that suggested significant processing difficulties. "My king, I remember your designation, but the intervening period appears to be missing from my accessible data storage. I cannot provide the requested report without additional memory reconstruction." The pattern repeated as Szarekh moved among his former commanders and advisors. Some retained enough of their consciousness to function, but many had suffered degradation that reduced them to shadows of their former selves. The implications were staggering. If this was representative of the Empire as a whole, then the force that had once conquered the galaxy might lack the cohesion and intelligence necessary to defend it. "The damage is extensive but not irreparable," announced Cryptek Orikan, his consciousness apparently enhanced rather than diminished by the long sleep. "I have been analyzing the patterns of degradation across our awakened populations. Many personality matrices can be reconstructed using backup data from the Great Archive." Szarekh turned his attention to the Cryptek, noting the temporal distortions that flickered around his form like heat mirages. "The Great Archive survived the hibernation?" "Intact and accessible," Orikan confirmed. "Your pre-exile protocols ensured that critical cultural and personality data would be preserved regardless of individual matrix failures. We can rebuild what was lost, though the process will require time and resources." For the first time since his return, Szarekh felt something approaching hope. The Great Archive had been his final gift to his people before entering exile. A comprehensive backup of Necron civilization that included not just technical specifications but personality templates, cultural traditions, and the accumulated wisdom of 60 million years of existence. If it had survived the Great Sleep, then perhaps his people's essence could be restored along with their consciousness. "Begin reconstruction protocols immediately," he commanded, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Priority designation: senior command staff and tactical specialists. The threat approaching our galaxy requires minds capable of strategic thinking, not mere operational efficiency." As the tomb complex came alive with activity, Szarekh found himself facing a different challenge: how to explain to his newly awakened subjects that their long sleep had ended not because of successful recovery, but because of approaching annihilation. The Tyranids, for that was the name by which the younger races knew the Great Devourer, represented a form of existence that was antithetical to everything the Necrons had become. "Gather the senior staff," he instructed Imhotep, who had remained at his side throughout the reunion. "I must brief them on the nature of the threat we face. They will need to understand not just what is coming, but why it represents an existential challenge to our continued existence." The briefing took place in the tomb's strategic center, a vast chamber where hololithic displays could project tactical information on a galactic scale. As Szarekh activated the systems and began displaying data from his long journey through the void, he watched his commander's consciousness matrices process information that challenged their fundamental understanding of the universe. "The entities approaching our galaxy represent evolution taken to its ultimate conclusion," he explained, as three-dimensional models showed the massive bioships moving through intergalactic space. "They exist solely to consume and reproduce, converting all matter and energy into more of themselves. They do not negotiate, they do not retreat, and they do not distinguish between organic and mechanical life." The implications sent ripples of analysis through the assembled Necrons' consciousness. They had fought the Old Ones, who sought to preserve and nurture life across the galaxy. They had served the Cetan, who consumed stellar energy but left matter largely intact. But the Tyranids were something entirely different, a force that would reduce the galaxy to constituent atoms in service of their endless hunger. "Tactical assessment," Imhotep requested, his strategic mind already working to process the threat's parameters. "Can they be defeated through conventional military action?" "Unknown," Szarekh replied with mechanical honesty. "Their numbers are beyond current calculation. Their adaptation capabilities exceed any enemy we have previously encountered, and their coordination suggests a form of collective intelligence that operates on galactic scales. Victory will require more than superior weapons. It will require unity of purpose among all galactic civilizations." The silence that followed was filled with the humming of quantum processors as each Necron analyzed the implications for themselves and their species. They had awakened to find themselves facing not conquest or subjugation, but total extinction, not just of their physical forms, but of everything they represented as a civilization. "Then we fight," declared Lord Zandrek, his damaged consciousness rendering the decision with startling clarity. "Not because we expect to win, but because the alternative is unacceptable. We are Necrons. We do not surrender, we do not flee, and we do not permit others to determine our fate." The declaration carried through the assembled nobles like a virus, triggering responses that echoed through consciousness matrices that had forgotten what it meant to choose defiance over survival. For the first time since the Biotransference, the Necrons had found something worth fighting for that transcended their individual existence: the right to exist at all. The return of memory had brought more than just restored consciousness. It had brought purpose. The Silent King had come home not to rule over an empire, but to forge a species into something capable of defending the galaxy itself. Whether they would prove equal to the challenge remained to be seen, but for the first time in 60 million years, the Necrons had a reason to find out. Chapter 8. The Broken Protocols. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came from the tomb world of Perdition, where Sarekh's awakening signals had triggered responses that defied every protocol in the Necron archives. Instead of the measured hierarchical emergence from hibernation that his return should have initiated, the tomb's systems screamed with chaotic data transmissions that spoke of madness and malfunction on a planetary scale. "Signal analysis complete," reported Cryptek Oriken, his temporal sight allowing him to perceive patterns in the chaos that escaped conventional sensors. Perdition's awakening has resulted in total command structure collapse. The hibernation cycles have created feedback loops that turned their consciousness matrices against each other. They are experiencing what human psychologists might classify as schizophrenia, but occurring simultaneously across an entire population. The news sent ripples of concern through the assembled command staff aboard the Worldbreaker. Perdition had once been a crown jewel of the Necron Empire, home to some of their most brilliant tactical minds and advanced technologies. If its entire population had been rendered insane by the awakening process, it represented both a strategic loss and a terrifying preview of what might await other tomb worlds. "How extensive is the damage?" Szarekh inquired, his consciousness already calculating the implications for his broader awakening plans. If one of their most sophisticated tombs had suffered complete system failure, how many others might have experienced similar catastrophes? Oriken's response was delivered with the temporal certainty that came from perceiving multiple probability streams simultaneously. Complete personality dissolution in 73% of the population. The remainder exhibit varying degrees of consciousness fragmentation, making them unsuitable for military operations or technological work. Recommendation: containment until reconstruction procedures can be developed. But Perdition was only the beginning. As more tomb worlds responded to Zarekh's awakening signals, a disturbing pattern emerged. Roughly 1 in 3 suffered some form of critical malfunction that rendered their populations unreliable or outright dangerous. 60 million years had been beyond even Necron engineering tolerances, and the price of that extended hibernation was becoming clear. The tomb world of despair had awakened to find its population trapped in recursive memory loops, endlessly reliving the final days before the Great Sleep without any awareness of the present. They moved through their routines with mechanical precision but could not process new information or respond to changed circumstances. Their minds were perfect museums of the past, but useless for addressing current threats. Memory lock syndrome, diagnosed Cryptek Illuminor Saras, his consciousness still sharp despite the long sleep. Their personalities became so deeply nested in hibernation dreams that they cannot distinguish between memory and reality. They exist in a permanent state of temporal displacement. Even more disturbing was the fate of the tomb world Malice, where the awakening process had somehow reversed the hierarchical command structures that governed Necron society. Nobles awoke believing themselves to be warriors, while actual warriors possessed the memories and authority patterns of lords. The result was a civilization where everyone remembered being someone else, creating a society of permanent identity crisis. The personality matrices were corrupted during an attempted consciousness transfer, Zarekh's explained, after analyzing the data streams from Malice. Instead of preserving individual identities, the hibernation systems began randomly redistributing personality components across the population. Each awakened Necron possesses fragments of dozens of different individuals. But perhaps most tragic was the tomb world that Szarekh had once called home, the ancient necropolis of Dynasty Prime, where he had ruled before the Biotransference and from which he had departed for his long exile. When the awakening signals reached the tomb systems, they triggered a cascade failure that had been building for millions of years. Dynasty Prime is gone, Imhotep reported, his voice carrying harmonics that might have been grief if such emotions remained accessible to them. The tomb complex suffered complete structural collapse approximately 12 million years ago. Geological analysis suggests the planet's core destabilized due to the massive energy requirements of the hibernation systems. The news struck Szarekh with something that transcended mere disappointment. Dynasty Prime had been more than just a tomb world. It had been the repository of their empire's most ancient traditions, the place where the original command protocols had been encoded, and the cultural archive that contained the earliest records of their species' transformation. Its loss was not just strategic, but existential. The backup archives, Szarekh inquired, though he already suspected the answer from Imhotep's tone. Unrecoverable. The planet's destruction vaporized all surface installations and compromised the deep storage vaults. We have lost approximately 40% of our pre-Biotransference cultural data, including the original personality templates for the earliest Necronter nobility. The implications rippled through Szarekh's consciousness like shockwaves. The Necrons who had awakened successfully were already diminished shadows of their former selves, operating with damaged personality matrices and incomplete memories. Now, it became clear that even their attempts at reconstruction would be limited by the loss of fundamental reference data. Status of other primary tomb worlds? Szarekh asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full scope of the disaster. The report that followed painted a picture of an empire in ruins. Of the original 300 major tomb worlds that had entered the Great Sleep, fewer than half were responding to signals. Of those that did respond, only about 60% had awakened successfully. The remainder suffered various forms of malfunction that ranged from simple hibernation failure to complete consciousness dissolution. "We are not the force that once conquered the galaxy," Szarekh admitted to his assembled commanders, the words carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the chamber itself. "We are the scattered remnants of that force, awakening to find ourselves damaged and diminished. The question is whether what remains is sufficient to face the threat approaching our galaxy." Yet, even as he catalogued the extent of their losses, Szarekh began to perceive patterns in the data that suggested opportunities as well as challenges. The tomb worlds that had awakened successfully were often those that had maintained the most sophisticated backup systems and redundant consciousness archives. If those systems could be replicated and deployed to the damaged tombs, perhaps some of the lost populations could be restored. "Initiate Project Resurrection," he commanded, the words carrying authority that cut through the gloom of their situation. All functional tomb worlds are to contribute technical specialists and consciousness reconstruction technology. We will rebuild what was lost, even if we must do so one personality matrix at a time. The project that followed was unprecedented in Necron history. Not the construction of new technologies or the conquest of new territories, but the systematic restoration of their own damaged species. Cryptechs, who had once designed weapons capable of destroying stars, now applied their expertise to the delicate work of consciousness reconstruction. Warriors who had once led armies across galactic battlefields became archaeologists, carefully excavating personality fragments from corrupted databanks. "The process is slower than anticipated," Szarekh reported after months of work. "Each consciousness matrix is unique, and the patterns of degradation vary significantly between individuals. What works for one personality type may cause further damage to another. We are essentially learning to perform surgery on the very concept of identity itself, Some successes emerged from the painstaking work. The noble houses of 3 damaged tomb worlds were successfully restored using backup data from their sister dynasties. A brilliant cryptech, whose consciousness had been scattered across multiple storage matrices, was carefully reassembled, his genius intact despite the temporary fragmentation. Even some of the identity-swapped inhabitants of Malice began to show signs of stabilization as reconstruction algorithms sorted their mixed personalities back into coherent individuals. But for every success, there were multiple failures. Some consciousness matrices had been so thoroughly corrupted that reconstruction was impossible. The essential patterns that defined an individual's identity had been lost beyond recovery. Others had become so integrated with their damaged state that attempts at repair only caused further dissolution. "We must accept that some of our people are simply lost," Szarekh finally acknowledged after reviewing months of progress reports. The Great Sleep claimed them as surely as any weapon in the war in heaven. We can mourn their passing, in whatever way our mechanized consciousness allows for mourning, but we cannot allow grief to prevent us from preparing those who remain for the battles ahead. The harsh calculus of survival had become their new reality. The Necron empire that Szarekh was attempting to rebuild would be smaller than what had existed before the Great Sleep, populated by consciousness that were themselves diminished echoes of their former glory. Yet, even diminished, they possessed capabilities that the galaxy's younger races could barely comprehend. Assessment of current military capabilities, Imhotep requested during one of their strategy sessions, his tactical mind already working to determine what kind of force they could field against the approaching Tyranids. The answer was both encouraging and sobering. They had approximately 40 functional tomb worlds under their direct control, with perhaps 20 more that could be brought online with sufficient technical support. Their total population numbered in the low billions, a fraction of their pre-sleep strength, but still representing one of the largest concentrations of advanced artificial consciousness in the galaxy. More importantly, their technological capabilities remained largely intact. The weapons that had once humbled star gods still functioned. Their necrodermis bodies still granted them near immortality, and their understanding of space and time still exceeded that of any organic species. They were diminished, but not defenseless. The question, Szarekh mused as he studied tactical projections that spanned the galaxy, is whether we can overcome 60 million years of isolation and fragmentation quickly enough to present a unified front against the Great Devourer. The Tyranids' greatest weapon is not their numbers or their adaptation, it is their perfect unity of purpose. Every organism serves the greater whole without question or hesitation. The irony was not lost on any of them. The biotransference that had cost them their souls had been intended to create exactly that kind of perfect unity. Instead, it had produced a species capable of independence and individual choice, capabilities that were both blessing and curse when facing an enemy that knew no such limitations. Then we must forge unity from choice rather than compulsion, declared Zahandrek, his damaged consciousness somehow providing insights that his undamaged peers missed. We cannot be what we once were, but we can choose to be what the galaxy needs us to become. The wisdom in his words echoed through the assembly, triggering recognition protocols in consciousness that had forgotten what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. They were no longer the slaves of star gods or the automatons of absolute monarchy. They were beings capable of choosing their own purpose, and that purpose would be the defense of existence itself against the hunger that approached from beyond the galactic rim. The broken protocols had revealed the full cost of their transformation and their long sleep. But in acknowledging that cost, they had also discovered something unexpected: the capacity to rebuild not just their technology and their armies, but their very identity as a species. The Silent King's return had brought more than just command authority. It had brought the possibility of redemption. Whether that possibility could be realized before the Great Devourer arrived remained the greatest challenge they had ever faced. But for the first time since the Biotransference, the Necrons were facing that challenge as beings capable of hope rather than mere calculation. It was, perhaps, the most human thing about them, and their greatest strength in the battles to come. Chapter 9. The Weight of Crowns. In the deepest vault of the Worldbreaker, Szarekh stood before a crystalline archive that contained something no other being in the galaxy possessed: the complete command protocols of the Necron Empire. For 60 million years, these quantum-encrypted matrices had traveled with him through the void between galaxies, their databanks holding the keys to absolute authority over every awakened tomb world. The temptation to activate them was overwhelming. With a single command sequence, he could override the consciousness of every Necron Lord, every Cryptek, every warrior in the Empire. Their individual wills would become extensions of his own, their choices mere echoes of his decisions. In the face of the approaching Tyranid threat, such unity might be the only path to survival. The command protocols remain functional, reported his ship's consciousness with mechanical precision. All awakened Necron populations are within transmission range. Authorization required for activation. But as Szarekh studied the archive, he found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice before him. The very reasons that had driven him into exile, the recognition that absolute power had cost his people their souls, now argued against using the one tool that could guarantee their coordination against the Great Devourer. "My king," came a voice from behind him, and Szarekh turned to see Imhotep approaching through the vault's secured entrance. The Stormlord moved with the measured precision that characterized all their kind, but something in his posture suggested unease. "The Dynasty Lords have assembled as requested. They await your guidance on the unified response to the Tyranid threat." The meeting that followed would determine not just the Necron's strategy against the approaching swarm, but the fundamental nature of what their species would become. In the Worldbreaker's strategic center, representatives from 40 tomb worlds had gathered, some present in physical form, others appearing as hololithic projections transmitted across vast distances. Each lord bore the marks of the Great Sleep differently. Overlord Enriquir maintained the commanding presence that had made him a legend during the War in Heaven, his consciousness apparently strengthened by isolation. Nemesor Zandrek's damaged mind paradoxically provided clarity that his undamaged peers lacked. The ancient destroyer lord known only as the Undying carried scars that spoke of battles fought in dreams that lasted geological ages. "Lords of the Empire," Szarekh began, his words carrying harmonics that identified him to every consciousness present as their rightful sovereign. "We face a threat that exceeds anything in our recorded history. The Great Devourer approaches our galaxy with the intent of consuming every form of life, mechanical and organic alike. Our response will determine not just our survival, but the survival of civilization itself." The tactical displays that followed painted a picture of cosmic horror. The Tyranid bioships, now less than 800,000 years from the galactic rim, had grown larger during their journey through intergalactic space. Their numbers defied calculation. Their adaptive capabilities suggested intelligence beyond conventional understanding, and their hunger knew no bounds. Preliminary analysis suggests that conventional military response will be insufficient, announced Cryptek Oriken, his temporal sight revealing probability streams that converged on extinction. "The Tyranids' reproductive rate and adaptation speed exceed our capacity to destroy them through direct confrontation. Victory will require coordination not just among our own forces, but with the galaxy's organic civilizations. The suggestion sent ripples of analysis through the assembled lords. Working with organic species violated every instinct that the war in heaven had bred into them. The younger races were ephemeral, unreliable, prone to panic and infighting when faced with existential threats. Yet the mathematics were undeniable. Even the combined might of all functional tomb worlds would be insufficient to stand alone against the approaching swarm. Proposal: Alliance protocols with select organic civilizations, stated Overlord Trazyn with characteristic directness. The humans show promise despite their primitive technology. Their Imperium demonstrates organizational capabilities that suggest potential for meaningful cooperation. The humans are barely civilized barbarians, objected Lord Vargard Albayron, his consciousness still struggling with identity fragments from the Great Sleep. They worship their own ignorance and fear anything they cannot understand. Alliance with such beings would be beneath our dignity. The debate that followed revealed the fundamental challenge facing Sarekh's leadership. Each lord retained enough independence of thought to form their own opinions about strategy and priorities. Some favored immediate aggressive action against the Tyranids while they were still approaching. Others argued for defensive preparations that would turn the galaxy into a fortress. A few suggested that the threat was so overwhelming that the Necrons should seek new galaxies rather than defend the current one. "You speak of dignity," Szarekh interrupted, his words cutting through the arguing voices with royal authority. "What dignity is there in extinction? What honor exists in allowing the galaxy to be consumed because we are too proud to work with those we consider our inferiors?" The silence that followed was filled with the humming of quantum processors as each lord analyzed the implications of their king's words. They had awakened to find themselves diminished in numbers and capability, yet they still clung to the arrogance that had characterized their empire at its height. "There is another option," Zandrek observed, his damaged consciousness providing insights that escaped his undamaged peers. "We could activate the command protocols. Unity through compulsion rather than choice. Every Necron consciousness subordinated to a single will, every decision flowing from a single source." The suggestion hung in the air like a weapon waiting to be fired. Everyone present understood the implications. With the command protocols active, Szarekh could override their individual consciousness and turn them into extensions of his own mind. The debates would end, the disagreements would cease, and the Empire would move with perfect coordination toward whatever goal their king determined. "The protocols would solve our coordination problems," admitted Imhotep, his tactical mind recognizing the military advantages even as something deeper in his consciousness recoiled from the idea. Perfect unity of command, instantaneous communication, no possibility of conflicting orders or strategic disagreement. "It would also make us into exactly what the Citan intended," Szarekh replied quietly. "Tools without will, weapons without choice, consciousness without the capacity for growth or change. We would become the very thing we fought to escape." The weight of the decision pressed down on the assembled lords like a gravitational field. They could choose unity through compulsion and perhaps gain the coordination necessary to defeat the Tyranids, but at the cost of everything that made them more than sophisticated automatons. Or they could preserve their hard-won independence and risk extinction through division and disagreement. "I have carried the command protocols for 60 million years," Szarekh continued, his voice carrying harmonics of infinite weariness. "I have felt their weight with every calculation, every decision, every moment of doubt, the power to end all argument, to impose perfect order, to ensure that every choice serves the greater good. It would be so easy to activate them and spare myself the burden of persuading you to follow courses of action that logic demands." He paused, his consciousness processing memories of the long exile and the gradual understanding of what freedom meant to beings who had forgotten they possessed it. "But I have learned something during my time in the void," he said finally. "Command without consent is slavery, even when practiced upon the willing. The biotransference cost us our souls, but the great sleep gave us something unexpected in return: the capacity to choose our own purposes. I will not steal that gift from you, even if it means we face the great devourer as a fractured and diminished force." The declaration sent shockwaves through consciousness matrices that had expected authoritarian rule. Their king was offering them something that no Necron had possessed since before the biotransference: the right to disagree, to dissent, to choose their own paths even when those paths might lead to collective destruction. "Then, how do we achieve the unity necessary for victory?" asked Anrakir, his strategic mind struggling with the paradox of coordinated action without compulsion. "We forge it from choice rather than command," Szarekh replied, echoing Zahandrekh's earlier words. "We build consensus through debate, loyalty through respect, coordination through shared purpose rather than shared programming. It will be slower, more uncertain, more difficult than simply activating the protocols. But if we succeed, our victory will be meaningful in ways that compelled cooperation never could be." The council that followed was unlike any in Necron history. Lords who had once received orders without question now found themselves required to argue, persuade, and compromise. Strategies were debated rather than simply implemented. Tactical disagreements were resolved through logic and discussion rather than hierarchical authority. It was chaotic, inefficient, and occasionally frustrating. It was also the first time since the biotransference that the Necrons had governed themselves as beings capable of independent thought rather than sophisticated tools. The weight of crowns, Szarekh realized, was not the burden of command, but the responsibility of earning the right to lead. Whether this experiment in consensus-based leadership would prove sufficient to face the approaching storm remained to be seen. But for the first time in 60 million years, the Necrons would meet their destiny as a free people rather than as slaves to their own perfection. Chapter 10: The Silent King's Burden. 10,000 years had passed since Sarekh's return from the void, and the galaxy had settled into a pattern of constant vigilance that showed no signs of ending. From the command center of his flagship, now anchored in orbit around the rebuilt tomb world of Sanctuary, the Silent King observed reports flooding in from across the known galaxy. Each one a reminder of the delicate balance between survival and annihilation that defined existence in this new age. Tyrannid scout organisms detected in the Ghoul stars, reported Overlord Imhotep, his consciousness now enhanced by millennia of experience fighting the Great Devourer's advance forces. Minimal biomass, likely probe entities testing defensive capabilities. Recommended response: surgical elimination, followed by enhanced sensor surveillance. The pattern had become familiar during the long war of preparation. The main Tyrannid fleets remained beyond the galactic rim, but their advanced scouts had been probing the galaxy's edges for thousands of years. Each incursion was met with coordinated response from Necron, Imperial, and occasionally even Orc forces, an alliance that would have been unthinkable before the great threat forced cooperation between ancient enemies. Szarekh processed the tactical data with the efficiency of 60 million years of experience, but beneath the mechanical analysis lay something that approached satisfaction. The galaxy had learned to fight as a unified entity when necessary, setting aside territorial disputes and racial hatred in favor of coordinated defense against extinction. It was not the empire he had once ruled, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a civilization worth preserving. "Status of the Pharos network?" he inquired, referencing the galaxy-spanning communication system that had become the backbone of coordinated defense planning. "Operational efficiency at 94.7%, responded Cryptek Oriken, whose temporal manipulation abilities had proven invaluable in maintaining instantaneous communication across galactic distances. The Imperial Astronomicon provides primary navigation reference, while our quantum entanglement relays ensure backup communication in case of warp storm interference. Response time for coordinated defense has been reduced to 0.3 standard years from initial contact to force deployment." The achievement represented more than technical sophistication. It embodied a level of cooperation between species that had seemed impossible when Szarekh first returned from exile. Humans who had once viewed the Necrons as soulless monsters now worked alongside them in planning sessions that determined the fate of entire sectors. Eldari, who had fled their dying empire, had found common cause with the same beings who had once served the Satan that destroyed their ancestors. Yet, even as he catalogued their successes, Szarekh remained acutely aware of what had been lost in the process of building this new galactic order. The Necron Empire that had awakened from the Great Sleep bore little resemblance to the force that had once conquered the galaxy. Of the billions who had entered hibernation, fewer than 60 million remained functional. The rest had been claimed by time, malfunction, or the gradual entropy that not even Necron technology could indefinitely delay. Personal log, Szarekh designation Silent King. He recorded in the private archives that had become his only confidant during the long millennia of his return. "Today marks the 10,000th anniversary of my return from exile. The galaxy has achieved a level of coordination against the Tyranid threat that exceeds my most optimistic projections. Yet, I find myself questioning whether the civilization we have built to resist extinction is still worth the sacrifices we have made to preserve it." The question haunted him during the quiet moments between crisis responses and strategic planning sessions. The organic races had adapted to the reality of constant threat by developing ever more sophisticated ways of destroying life before it could be consumed by the Great Devourer. The Imperium's Inquisition had become expert at detecting and eliminating Tyranid infiltrator organisms, often at the cost of entire populations. The Eldari had abandoned their traditional reluctance to engage in direct conflict, turning their remaining craft worlds into weapons of genocide that could sterilize entire systems before Tyranid spores could take hold. Even his own people had changed in ways that troubled his ancient consciousness. The Necrons who had awakened to face the Tyranid threat were harder, more ruthless, more willing to accept civilian casualties as necessary costs of strategic success. They retained their independence of thought, but that independence had been shaped by 10,000 years of preparing for a war that would determine whether consciousness itself would survive in the galaxy. Lord Anrakir reports completion of Operation Cleansing Fire, Imhotep announced, his words carrying harmonics that indicated both success and unease. The human colony world of Tertius Prime has been sterilized in accordance with Protocol 7. All organic matter eliminated before Tyranid spore penetration could reach critical mass. Szarekh processed the report with mechanical efficiency, but some deeper part of his consciousness recoiled from the implications. Protocol 7 was the euphemistic designation for the complete elimination of all life on a potentially compromised world. A strategy that had saved dozens of systems from Tyranid consumption, but had also cost the lives of millions of human civilians who might never have been infected at all. Confirmed kills: 4 million Imperial citizens, species classification human. The report continued with clinical precision. Estimated Tyranid biomass prevented from reaching main hive fleet: 37 million metric tons. Strategic assessment: successful implementation of preemptive elimination protocols. The mathematics were undeniable. 4 million deaths to prevent 37 million tons of biomass from reaching the main Tyranid fleet was a strategically sound trade. Yet the boy king, who had once agonized over the Biotransference choice, still existed somewhere in the quantum matrices of Sharekh's consciousness, and that fragment recoiled from the casual mathematics of genocide. The burden of kingship, he mused to himself, using words his organic father had spoken countless millions of years before. To make choices that preserve the many by sacrificing the few, and to carry the weight of those choices until the stars themselves grow cold. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission from the Eldari craft world Ulthwé, where Farseer Eldrad Ulthran maintained one of the few remaining centers of prophetic ability in the galaxy. The ancient Eldari's face appeared on the hololithic display, his features bearing the weight of prescient knowledge that had kept his people alive through the darkest periods of galactic history. "Silent King," Eldrad began, his voice carrying harmonics of respect that would have been unthinkable before their alliance against the Great Devourer. "I bring word from the far site. The main Tyranid fleet has altered its approach vector. They are no longer aimed at the galactic core, but at the eastern fringe, where your tomb world of Xandrek maintains primary defensive coordination." The implications sent ripples of analysis through Sarekh's consciousness. If the Tyranids were specifically targeting Necron command centers, it suggested a level of strategic intelligence that exceeded their previous assessments. More troubling, it meant that their coordination efforts had become visible enough to attract the attention of the hive mind itself. "Estimated time until contact?" Szarekh inquired, his strategic mind already calculating deployment scenarios and resource allocation patterns. 700 years, assuming current velocity," Eldrad replied. "Sufficient time for evacuation of non-essential populations and the establishment of primary defensive positions. But, Silent King, my far sight suggests that this engagement will be different from previous encounters. The hive mind has learned from our defensive strategies. What approaches is not merely hunger, but hunger guided by intelligence that has studied our every response." The revelation carried implications that extended far beyond simple tactical planning. If the Tyranids had developed specific countermeasures to their defensive strategies, then the war that had been building for 10,000 years was about to enter its most critical phase. The Great Devourer was no longer simply a force of nature. It had become a strategic opponent capable of learning and adaptation on galactic scales. "Begin implementation of Contingency Protocol Omega," Szarekh commanded, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "All tomb worlds to receive immediate strategic briefings. Allied force coordination to shift to maximum efficiency parameters. And Farseer, thank you for the warning." Eldrad's image nodded with the grave dignity that marked all their interactions. "We stand together against the darkness, Silent King. Whatever our past conflicts, they pale beside the threat to existence itself." As the transmission ended, Szarekh found himself contemplating the strange ironies that had shaped his existence. He had begun as an organic king struggling to save his people from genetic extinction. The Biotransference had made him into a mechanical tyrant ruling soulless automatons. His exile had transformed him into a solitary wanderer, carrying the burden of collective memory. His return had made him into something unprecedented, a leader who ruled through consensus rather than compulsion, preserving freedom even in the face of annihilation. "The Silent King's burden," he reflected in his private logs, "is not the weight of absolute power, but the responsibility of earning the right to guide those who could choose to follow others. I have ruled through divine mandate, through technological supremacy, through command protocols that made disobedience impossible. Now I rule through something far more fragile and far more valuable: the willing cooperation of beings who understand that survival requires choices greater than individual preference. Whether that cooperation would prove sufficient to face the fully awakened intelligence of the hive mind remained the ultimate test of everything he had built since his return. But as he prepared for what might be the final war, Szarekh carried with him something that had sustained him through 60 million years of exile: the knowledge that some things were worth preserving even at the cost of everything else. The Silent King's burden was heavy, but it was a burden he carried by choice rather than compulsion. In a galaxy where freedom itself hung in the balance, that distinction might prove to be the difference between mere survival and victory worth achieving. The stars themselves would bear witness to whether that hope would prove justified. And so ends our chronicle of the Silent King's rise, though his story continues to unfold among the distant stars. In the darkness between certainty and hope, Szarekh carries forward the dreams of a species that traded flesh for metal and found, in that exchange, both damnation and the possibility of redemption. Sleep well, wanderers, and remember, even in the grim darkness of the far future, kings may still choose to serve rather than command, and in that choice lies the difference between tyranny and true leadership.